Welcome everyone to the Positive Climate Change Narrative WCS Book Club event. Just want to say first off, thank you so much for everyone for being here. You could be doing anything tonight. You could be mindlessly scrolling on social media, but
Okay. Jammed up. Hi, everyone. I think that Natalie's Wi-Fi might have went out, but what she was going to say is that you can literally be anywhere tonight, but you've chosen to be here with us, Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability, the Los Angeles chapter, and we're super excited to be here. Natalie, are you back? And you're on mute.
I'm so sorry.
No worries.
I don't know what happened. Where did I leave off?
Let's just hop right into the agenda.
Okay, great. So first off, we'll do introductions. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping. I'll do a brief summary about the book, and then we'll hear some amazing insights from our speaker. And then next, we'll be having 2 breakout sessions where we'll really be facilitating discussion about ideas from the book. And then we're looking to hear back from everyone about what they discussed in their groups. And then at the end, we'll do a thank you and wrap up. Next. So for those of you who don't know, Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability is a network of professional women working in the clean tech and sustainability economy. This is a great organization to grow your professional networks, and they offer monthly events in person and online, and as well as TED style talks with Google every year. So if you don't know how to use Zoom, I can't teach you that right now. There's not enough time, but just a few reminders. Please be respectful, and please remember to unmute and mute yourself appropriately. And then lastly, a really great way to get to know the other women on this call is to share your LinkedIn profile in the chat and to kind of facilitate meeting people that way. Okay, and WCS also has a virtual membership. So if you're interested in that, please use the QR code and learn more about that virtual membership that gives you access to WCS events, happy hours, webinars, and other benefits. So I mentioned I'm Natalie. I started, as Camille may have mentioned, I started the WCS Book Club, and the reason that I wanted to create this for WCS members is because I love speaking about ideas with other women, especially women within my industry who really know what I'm talking about. And so I wanted to create a space where we can just all share in dialogue and share our ideas, and just continuously learn more, because our industry is changing so fast all the time. I wanted to choose this book in particular because I feel like science fiction has so much to teach us. And I think for those of you who read this book, you will probably agree that this book in particular really just opens your mind to all the different possibilities of visions for our future, and positive ones. So just to give a quick refresher for those of you who might have read this book a while ago, or maybe for those of you who haven't finished the book, we have our 2 main characters. We have Mary Murphy, she's the chairman for the Ministry of the Future, and we have Frank May, who's a traumatized survivor of a brutal heat wave in India. And that's how the book opens, actually, is just this brutal heat wave in India that kills millions fairly quickly. In response to that, the Indian government conducts some geoengineering exercises and begins widespread political and economic transformation. And at the same time, we're seeing kind of eco-terrorist groups kind of pop up throughout this book. One of the main events in the book is where Frank May kidnaps Mary Murphy as a warning that her agency is just not doing enough to combat climate change. And this leaves a lasting impression on her and really guides her in making significant structural changes. And the whole book kind of documents all the new technologies, new systems, and ultimately leading to a bumpy but overall positive future. So it's a really great book, and hopefully if you haven't finished reading it, you'll do so. I know it is long, but it's truly one of my favorite books. And again, I'll just say we're so happy to have our speaker today. She has many accolades to her name. She is the chair of the Department of English and professor at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She is also a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow and former president of Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. She's also a co-founder of UCLA's Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies and producer and writer of Urban Arc Los Angeles. So welcome, Ursula, and thank you, or Professor Ursula, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Natalie. It's great to be here, and it's great to talk about what is also one of my favorite books. I'm a great fan of science fiction, but a lot of science fiction over the last 20 years has been quite bleak, especially when it's focused on environmental issues. So it's great to be able to talk about this book a little bit today. And thank you for your very concise summary of a very, very multidimensional book, Natalie. Could you switch to the climate change facts and narrative slide, please? These are just a couple of illustrations of how climate change is commonly presented in science, and numbers are often translated, as you know, into graphs and pie charts and other kind of visual aids that help us understand a little bit what's going on numerically. Still, for a lot of people, these numbers are not intuitively graspable, and they don't sort of either cognitively or emotionally really connect unless they're linked to the story of an individual, of individuals, or of groups that whose functioning we can understand. And this is something that environmental scientists, as well as environmental writers and filmmakers, have done since the 1960s. Paul Ehrlich, when he wrote The Population Bomb, in the first edition, he had little science fiction stories interspersed between the chapters. But that book also illustrated what the problem sometimes is with storytelling. So Ehrlich was attacked not so much for what he predicted about population growth, but for these vignettes that came between the scientific chapters that people thought did not really adequately represent the generality of the scientific insights. So storytelling is an incredibly powerful way of translating scientific insights and scientific discoveries and numbers into storylines that most people and the general public find understandable. But it doesn't come without its problems. And one problem in the past has been that typically these narratives are told from the viewpoint of people in the global north, in Europe or North America, and that they address it from just the viewpoint of one particular set of people. Next slide, please. So Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future and several of his other novels really try to address that. So if you think about this novel in sort of a more general panorama of what climate narratives in fiction and film look like, there's three major types, I would say. One is the disaster narrative, where you get an account of a major disaster like a hurricane or a flood or a major wildfire that is triggered by climate change and that then lead the involved characters to an understanding of the broader implications. So I've put a few examples on the slide. Could we have the next slide, please? So The Day After Tomorrow, you've probably all seen at one point or another, Liz Jensen's The Rapture and Nathaniel Rich's Odds Against Tomorrow, which was a novel that really predicted Hurricane Sandy in amazing ways, are examples of these novels and films that are built around one disaster that points to the larger risks of climate change. Next slide, please. So the second type of narrative that's commonly used to get climate change across through narrative is the apocalyptic or dystopian or post-apocalyptic narrative. So those are a little bit different in that they don't focus on one place so much as on the whole world, and they present us with a whole series of events and changes that transform societies, or that have already, in the post-apocalyptic stories, have already fundamentally changed them to the point where it's the end of the world as we know it, right? In some way, there's a whole totally new world that results from these changes, many of which, of course, include disasters, but are not limited to them. Can we have the next slide? So the Australian novelist George Turner's The Sea in Summer, which was one of the earliest climate change novels, is an example of that. Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl, which is set in Bangkok in Thailand, but then gives a panorama of the entire world, and Claire V. Watkins's Gold Fame Citrus, all give us these views of a world that has fundamentally changed and in which the characters can no longer live the way that they had before, in which totally new social structures have emerged, some good, but many of them bad. Next slide, please. The last type of story that gets commonly told about climate change is I would call a proxy narrative. So those tend to be quieter films and stories that don't focus so much on disaster, but on the development, interior as well as material, of one character or a few character. Typically, these tend to be melancholy stories, but not necessarily disastrous ones. So what we're supposed to take away from these stories is that the loss of one character is kind of a proxy for the losses that the globe experiences. Can we have the next slide? So the Finnish novel Parantaja, The Healer, is a good example of a journalist who searches throughout the entire novel for his disappeared wife. And we take that as against the background of a flooded Helsinki that is overrun by climate refugees. Ilya Troyanov's Icetow, or The Meditations of Zeno in the English translation, is a story of a geologist who mourns the melting of his glacier. Megan Hunter's The End We Start From focuses on a family, but in each case, we're invited to think about the fates of these characters as sort of a substitute, a way of understanding larger losses, larger changes that are occurring. So as I said, tend to be a lot quieter than the disaster or apocalyptic narratives, and a little more focused on individual characters. Now, a lot of these stories are, as you can already tell, quite pessimistic. Can we have the next slide, please? So Natalie asked me to talk a little bit about why optimistic narratives are important. Now, I want to say, first of all, in defense of disaster and apocalyptic stories, that actually, there's a reason why there's so many of them. Fear can mobilize readers or viewers to action. And so trying to avoid a future that you may not want can actually be quite a powerful incentive to action. But it's also true that quite often these stories of disaster and apocalypse don't really show us a way out of crisis and don't show us what a better future could look like. And that's really a necessary impulse for taking action. The second reason is that disaster and apocalypse and post-apocalypse, especially the film and television versions, are spectacles that we watch sort of from a sofa, eating popcorn, and that become just mere entertainment that we enjoy, but that we don't really take any impulses for action away from. And a lot of people also report, and this is confirmed by empirical studies, that a constant barrage of stories and images of disaster and apocalypse, especially when they're really well done, can actually inspire the readers and the viewers with sadness and hopelessness, and make them feel paralyzed and powerless rather than inspiring them to action. And then sometimes, and this is really, really interesting, we've also found in our research that readers or viewers sometimes react to images of climate disaster, not with fear and the impulse to take action about climate change, but with fear of the consequences and the people involved in them. So Paolo Bacigalupi wrote a novel called The Water Knife that features climate refugees. In this future, they come from Mexico to Arizona. Sorry, not from Mexico, from Texas to Arizona. And they're quite desperate and do some violent acts. When people were asked, how they felt about these climate refugees, a lot of them sympathized with them, but also said, well, I would do the same if I were in their situation. And that's why I'm glad that there are no climate refugees where I live, because I would be really scared of them. Well, that wasn't quite the answers we had hoped for. So presenting these images of disaster and tragedy can have unexpected reactions. Optimistic narratives, when they're good, don't minimize the challenges that lie ahead of us. Nobody doubts that there will be a lot of disasters and a lot of suffering that will occur over the next 100, 150 years. But I think the importance of optimistic narratives really is that they expand our imagination. They show us ways through crisis that we might not have thought of, and they show us what a different society could look like positively, not just negatively. So Kim Stanley Robinson likes to call this optopia. So not utopia, because he doesn't want it to be static and authoritarian and repressive. He wants it to be, and not perfect necessarily. It's not just a perfect society that's worth striving for, but one that's just better than what we have now. So he says optopia is the best you can get given the circumstances. Okay, next slide, please. So let's look a little bit at what KSR does in Ministry for the Future. So he does actually use the disaster narrative, as Natalie already mentioned. The story, the novel starts with a description of a horrendous heat wave in India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh and neighboring states, that ends up killing 20 million people. And an aid worker, Frank May, is in the middle of that and experiences it firsthand and is really super traumatized by it. And so, as anybody would be, obviously. So you read this, when I first read this novel, I thought, oh my God, now Kim Stanley Robinson also is going to tell this disaster story. But the point is that actually this disaster propels India into trying certain forms of geoengineering, and they do actually bring global temperature down, at least for a few years. And the novel describes that. So it does give us a horrendous description of disaster. So he incorporates that genre, but then moves out of it and beyond it. And then he does other things that are, I think, super interesting and move us beyond this problem of environmental stories just being told from one point of view. So over the 100-something chapters of the novel, you get a lot of different narrative voices, and they narrate their experience either as an I or as a he or she. And you get this sort of total diversity, intersectionality, plurality of voices, Black and white people, indigenous and non-indigenous people, voices from the global North and the global South, from every continent. And there's one chapter in particular, chapter 85, where you have people from every single continent, not every single country, but from about 36 different countries, presenting hopeful projects that they've undertaken successfully for the future. In the sort of more action-oriented parts of the novel, you have what we literary scholars call a parallax narrative structure. So you have the perspectives of different characters juxtaposed, and each of them describes their experience with climate change. So that's a technique that Kim Stanley Robinson took from John Dos Passos, a 20th century author who wrote about New York and about the United States and about the experience of the modern metropolis. So the whole point here is to say, no, there is not one main character, there's not one viewpoint. In order to understand the world as it is now, the planet, we really have to represent all of these heterogeneous and diverse and really different experiences. You'll also, and those of you who read the novel were no doubt amazed about how it goes back and forth between these action-oriented chapters that move the action forward, and that developing relationship between Mary Murphy, the Minister for the Future, and Frank May, the aid worker who then kidnaps her, as Natalie mentioned. But that's interspersed with a lot of other material and prose that reads almost like nonfiction, that is about some of the facts of climate change, that is about technological innovations that people come up with. It's about economic mechanisms, about a new carbon currency, and about carbon quantitative easing. Those of you who are in finance might find that really interesting. There's a lot of thinking about law and legislation and what that can do to address climate change. And there's a lot of thinking about how political movements emerge, what kinds of different political movements and social movements there are, and how effective they are. The other thing that you get that's super interesting is that sometimes you get very short little chapters that are narrated in the first person. It's either an I or a we. But in these very short chapters, it's not a human who's speaking. So in one case, it's a herd of reindeer or caribou or elephants. So it's the herd animals who are speaking. In another one, it's the sun. And yet another one, it's a photon. So Robinson really tries to show us that humans are not the only ones who think and act and interact with the world, that there's lots of non-human agents that influence how we experience the world of climate change, and what our future is. And the plot really moves around the world, and in some cases we accompany Mary Murphy's travels, but in other cases we just move to different sites around the world. It's anchored, though, in the Swiss city of Zurich, and that's not haphazard. There's certain aspects of the city of Zurich and then of Switzerland as a country that becomes sort of a microcosm for other places and for the globe as a whole. So that's a little bit, those are some of the literary techniques that are super interesting and make for a really adventurous reading experience. This is not your standard novel, but it'll grip you, and you'll roll through those several hundred pages once you start, I promise you. Next slide, please. Natalie also asked me to talk a little bit about, how we can use optimistic narratives, and it doesn't have to be a novel, right? It can be an optimistic story that's a magazine cover story, or a newspaper item, or a short documentary. And the documentary that I wrote and produced that she mentioned was one that talked about the red-crowned parrots of Pasadena as actually an endangered species that's found a new home in our metropolis. So how can we use optimistic climate narratives to inspire action, or environmental narratives more generally? Well, here's some of the things that I try to teach my students about that. So first thing to know is, who is your audience? To whom are you trying to tell your story? And that includes, of course, stories that you all who are in clean tech and sustainability, stories that you may want to tell about your company and how it contributes to a better future. So having a clear idea of who your audience is, what they know, what they don't know, what they care about, and what their aspirations might be, where they want to go, what their interests are in terms of not just where they are at, but where they want to be in 10 or 20 years' time is really important, because there isn't one story of climate change that will change everybody. You need a lot of different stories for different audiences. The second is what we call sort of a theory of change. So what are your basic assumptions in the stories that you want to tell about what needs to change in our society and how it could realistically change? And that ties in with what goals your narrative has. So do you want people to individually make changes in their behavior? So for example, do you want to encourage them not to use plastic bottles or to recycle them if they do? Or do you want to get them involved in more structural changes, that is, in political action to get manufacturers to recycle plastic or replace it with other materials? Or do you want to achieve both? And those are sort of really two different things. So if you want to combine both, you have to sort of think carefully about how you do that. I highly recommend the UC Climate Lab videos. which try to do that in very short videos of 5 minutes, and I can leave the link in the chat after we're done, so you can check those out. But so what the aim is, how you want to move your audience or toward what, will shape what kind of story you tell. It's also, I think, important to offer a vision. That is, to give people some idea of how a different relationship to nature, what it would look like, how it could be different, and to provide some models of how people or organizations have made changes that have actually, at least in part, succeeded in doing that. So, you know, are there examples of organizations that have effectively phased out plastic and have replaced it with other things, or that have been successful in plastic recycling? To stick with that example, but of course there are many others. I also always encourage every environmental storyteller not to shy away from complexity. I think environmental storytelling has often had a problem with telling stories that are too simple, too didactic, too sort of lifted finger, do this, don't do that. And most people don't actually like didactic stories. I don't like didactic stories particularly, and I don't like to be condescended to. And lots of people know that environmental problems aren't really simple. So don't shy away from a certain degree of complexity. And then finally, empathy is super important. Narratives have as one of their main functions to give us an opportunity to see and think from a point of view that's really unlike our own. So conveying to people what climate change might look like from the point of view of somebody who is really unlike them is one of the really big opportunities. You may not want to grab a hold of that in every story you tell, but you certainly can use that to make it clear to people that not everybody experiences climate change in the same way. Or to stick with the example of plastic bottles, when I was in Indonesia 3 years ago, I was appalled at the number of plastic bottles on the beach. And I said, you know, to people who lived there, well, you know, why do you use so many plastic bottles? Well, it was because the water that comes out of the faucet is actually not safe to drink, especially for children. And the reason people throw plastic bottles on the beach is that in a lot of the smaller cities in the Indonesian archipelago, there is no sanitation, let alone recycling. So it's not necessarily ill will, and it made me look at plastic bottles and plastic trash in a very different way. All right, Natalie, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ursula. Those insights were really powerful, and you helped me have, my book list was already long to begin with, but now I have 9 more books to add. So thank you for sharing those books with us. I had never heard of some of those titles, so thank you a lot. Okay, great. So with that, we'll start our first breakout session. So to help facilitate dialogue, we have 3 questions for you here that you can speak with your group about. Feel free to speak to just one of the questions, or to, if you have time, you can talk to all of them. The first one is, which questions or topics from the book resonated with you most and why? I mean, there's so much covered in this book, so I would just love to hear what everyone is thinking. Second question is, do you think Ministry for the Future represents a realistic vision of a possible future? Which aspects do you find realistic or unrealistic, and why? And then the last one is, what other climate narratives have you heard of? So with that, I think we'll go into our groups. Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone had an enjoyable time as much as I did. That was really a great discussion. Does anyone, any of the facilitators or anybody else, want to share out what their groups had a chance to discuss?
Okay, should I go? It's Mariam.
Yes, please.
Okay, so we had a nice little group, and interestingly, one of the people in the group has read a lot of the book, and so we got excellent insight into it, and then we built on that to discuss issues around it as we are seeing live in action. So, for example, the fires in California or the issues, the floods elsewhere in Europe and such. And so we learned a lot about how the book is basically really positive, because what's important is we see so many of these books and movies out there that basically talk about gloom and doom. But as the speaker, Professor Ursula, mentioned, that we need to talk about, or focus things in the direction of taking action. So when you leave reading a book or watching a movie related to the climate space, you need to then, take action. So I think one thing that's really nice about this book is that it encourages that. And also, one of the people in our group, Sadat, said that it is definitely realistic. And we are definitely coming up with these kind of issues, and something like this could happen. For example, the drought in India in the book that killed a lot of people. And then people having the main character with PTSD, and then, frustration. So we covered a lot of different things about the book, as well as reality that's happening around us and how to work through those. Thank you.
Natalie, you're on mute.
Thank you. Definitely agree that it was hard reading that book, because it seemed like every chapter I would read, I would hear about a similar event taking place on the news. So definitely agree with you, Miriam, that this stuff it's not sci-fi. It's happening. It's starting to happen. We're starting to see it. Anyone else?
I want to put someone from our group on the spot, Diana. So I didn't make it all the way through the book. I got depressed. But Diana did, and she mentioned that one of her most, or I guess one of the most salient points or most interesting points was in the book, the tools, like the economic tools that the Ministry of the Future uses to actually get countries to start sequestering carbon. I'm interested, Diana, to hear you speak a little bit more about that.
Okay. Yeah, I found that fascinating. And I've read a few Kim Stanley Robinson books, and he always gets into the economics of it. And the Mars trilogy is, I would say, a lot about economics. But the way that they came up with the carbon quantitative easing and the carbon coin, and the work that the minister had to do to convince the central bankers, I think was one of the things that really impressed me, was just the negotiations and the narrative she was having to tell to these central bankers who thought it wasn't their job. And they finally came around, and the whole system started working, and also the integration with sort of the Facebooky kind of thing they came up with. It really started making huge difference. And it's one of the things I'm hopeful for with the carbon offset kind of markets that they're trying to figure out now. I'm not so sure how well it's going to work, but giving people who don't care about the environment or who don't care about people, but giving them economic tools that they really do care about is a big lever. And that was one of the things that I really like to see, that lever really move the world. So that was fun.
Hey guys, it's Sheila here, and we had a great group and a great conversation. And one of the things that jumped out for me in the discussion was the example of the method and the pace of travel in the book. How it took, rather than an 8-hour, round trip airfare across the country, it took 8 days in that process, and what that translates to in the difference of cultural and lifestyle. And I like to say a drop in the blood pressure, which is a very positive thing. I think that was really awesome experience. I personally have not read the book, but it's on my list along with the other 9 ones that we talked about today. But that was a big shout out, takeout from our discussion. I wanted to share back to the group.
Yeah, and just to add to that, since I was in your group, Deborah had a good phrase. She was saying that similar to the shift from fast food to slow food, hopefully we will one day see the transition from fast transportation to slow transportation.
Yes. Positive things.
Very nice similarity.
Anyone else want to share any out?
I think I want to share for the little discussion that we have in our group together with Diana as well, in Malini. We talk about the definition of prosperity that the author mentioned that in chapter 16, I believe he talked about it. And that's something that I'm personally, I'm from Venezuela, and there's a lot of changes in my country, and for my family, my friends, and the entire population. And one thing that really made me reflect about what he writes here is how we define prosperity today and how it needs to be defined for the future. Because today prosperity is very linked to consuming more, to emitting more. So how do we have a prosperous life, or what that means in the future, prosperity? And that definition needs to be defined again, I guess, by humans. And I personally believe that our lifestyle, the lifestyle that we decided to live, is one very important root cause of everything that is going on, and that the responsibility is not only in industries and government, but also in each of us and what each of us can do.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. And I remember in the book, I think he lists like 5 or 6 different current metrics that exist for happiness. So I think he listed off, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but I think there's the like Tibetan metric of happiness and a few others. So pretty cool. Awesome. Okay, I think we're ready for breakout 2.
All right, starting that soon. We got breakout questions number 2, in case you guys want in the chat. And then I will launch you guys off into your rooms.
Welcome back, everyone, from breakout 2. As our group was saying, that these breakouts are just too short. There's so much to talk about. So I'd love to hear what other groups talked about in their sessions. Would anyone like to share?
I can start with just a tiny thing that we chatted about with Ursula and Sam, is about, so the first question about tipping points and how maybe we might not have like a global tipping point that will impact everyone here on this planet. As we saw, COVID could have been this catalyst, but we can't really see like big changes in our behaviors towards climate change. So we will need different tipping points in different areas, because we will be impacted by different disastrous events. So I think it was kind of like and it brings back to like empathy and how we can relate, how to talk about one population or one community, and put it in like a narrative that they can understand and they can relate to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tipping points will be dependent on the place and the people. Very cool. Would anyone else like to share?
I wasn't in one of the breakout rooms, but I've had some like different thoughts. I love how Professor Ursula had shared, the context of like a business story with the sustainability story, and how you weave those things together for businesses in the sustainability world, but also businesses considering their social and environmental impact. And I kind of optimistically think that we're going to have a lot of new innovations that help with climate change. But then I also know that there will probably also be innovations that come along that end up using a lot more energy, like cryptocurrencies, if they're not in line with, you know, being sustainable or being consciously socially. So I think, you know, maybe there's these key players that if we switch the story on, that we switch the balance on, that they create like this domino effect in other areas, even when those people that end up in a further domino aren't specifically affected or, you know, thinking about it. And maybe that's investors. So investors, when they think through what they're going to invest in, they think through these things. So maybe like, what are the dominoes that need to start this? That's kind of what I think through. And thank you so much for your presentation. It was really great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alyssa. Would anyone else like to share from what they got from Breakout 2?
Hi, Natalie. It's Nana here. Yes, so we also mentioned how COVID it brought the world to a standstill, but did it transform our actions? Debatable, but we also looked at how governments need to play a more active role in terms of legislation and actually holding businesses accountable for some of the targets that they are setting. I think once we can also show businesses from a positive angle, the economic benefit for them going the sustainable route, I think that would be a starting block for them, maybe not to impose penalties, but to rather show them that it's profitable to be sustainable. That could change narratives.
I think that's super interesting because that's what the carbon coin, the carbon currency in the novel is meant to do. Yeah. That you actually can make profit off of taking carbon out of the atmosphere or diminishing your impact. So yeah, this is it's a great point.
Hi, this is Sheila and Professor Ursula. I can't wait to read your book. I have not. I'm very excited about it. We talked about just the general observation you made with the writing styles. That some are, the sky is falling, it's doomsday. The people have no power, they feel powerless, versus the optimistic ones, which are much more important, I believe, and it propels people, companies, and society to look at ways to retool, re-engineer, and to the point earlier discussed, to make it in a positive way. So I think I'm just really excited to be part of this discussion, and it expands the imagination of what can be done in a positive way, as opposed to the sky's falling and it's doomsday and the world's on fire.
Yeah. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to share?
I'd just like to bring up that we also talked about building empathy in our discussion. And I think like the most realistic tipping point we see is that enough like big countries really have to experience some of these tragic events in order to like make change on a larger scale. But I think one way to potentially preempt that, like not have to go through all those disasters, is to like find ways to build empathy around these issues, so that not every nation has to experience one of these tragedies before people are willing to like make change. And I just wanted to share like the conversation we just had around like cryptocurrencies related to carbon. I think what's interesting is like folks have already, like companies have already figured out that greenwashing is very effective. Like customers like it. So I think that's a good sign that like there is like, interest in the market, and like this could like potentially grow into like a full-blown solution, which for me is exciting.
Yeah, I have to do a lot more research about crypto after reading this book myself.
I just wanted to build on a couple things. This is Deborah. And one thing that I commented on in our first breakout group was that a lot of the solutions that he brought together, and he did an incredible amount of research, are actually real. They're already happening, or they're, being researched. And so it's not just totally fantastical, like something from another planet. But building on what Malini was just saying about empathy, Stacy in our last group ended right like as we were about to get kicked out of our breakout room by saying, we are the ministry for the future, like all of us right now. And I was like, oh, let's get t-shirts or like, and tell the world, because I mean, that's what's going to make it happen is we are all going to make it happen. And then Sophia, you said something earlier that resonated with me, was around redefining prosperity. And yeah, I mean, there was a lot of that in the book too, like universal basic income and, all kinds of other solutions, and really showing how they all have to come together. It's not just like the climate science, or it's not just, solar technology. It's all these different things. And that's why it's so exciting to see all of you here, because you're coming at this each from different angles and talents and perspectives as well. So yeah, I'm ready for to be a card carrying member of the Ministry for the Future.
We should totally get WCS LA t-shirts that say that.
Love that idea. Love it. Love it.
All right, but I'm in the Bay Area. I want one.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I love that, Deborah. I felt the same way, just seeing everyone here, all these women from some of you from different countries, different parts of the US.
And men too.
And men, sorry. Yes, yes. Sorry about that. But it is really inspiring to see everyone here. And I think that's also reflected in the book too, that you see a lot of important female characters in the book too. And yeah, again, it's like, when does fiction become reality? And I think this book does a good job of making you question, are we still in the book or are we in real life?
I love that he chosen the minister to be a woman. And I honestly feel that when it comes to sustainability, I think we have a different sense to understand and to really put, I don't know what is the best way to explain what I want to say, but I feel that we women have the sentiment of caring for more, for the world, for others. And I think we are definitely playing a very key role in this transformation, because I think we're entering a transformation completely of a complete reset of the way we live, the way we work, the way we see the world.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I know we have a few more minutes, so I did want to ask Professor Ursula, I'm just curious, what was your favorite theme of the book, favorite scene? I would love to hear from you, kind of like from an English department chair, like what was your favorite part of the book?
I mean, I kind of love these passages where something non-human speaks. So I'm really, really interested in film and in podcasts or audio works of composition. I'm also really interested in sort of experimental music and in film, how you can present things, not just from the perspective of humans that are unlike yourself, but from the perspective of like animals or plants, I always love that. But in terms of topics, I mean, one thing that I found really fascinating was, stuff that he doesn't sort of put so much emphasis on, but how, how the Midwest sort of becomes depopulated, but also becomes too arid to really do beef agriculture in, right? And so, but then it's also, okay, so there's fewer cows, but people also don't eat so much meat anymore because there was sort of like a mad cow disease incident that put most people off of eating a lot of beef. And so I was going to answer to the last in terms of future technologies. Something that I'm really excited about is artificial meat. I mean, I'm kind of vegetarian, verging on vegan, so I try to stay away from meat for a variety of reasons. But that's one of the ones where they're getting pretty close now to actually being able to produce stuff that tastes pretty meat-like, at least to those of us who actually like the taste of meat. And that, that would make one big difference, so I like the way in which, he doesn't really go into that. It's not one of the really big things, but it's mentioned by the way, right? And so that's one thing that I was excited about. And then in the narrative also, I mean, so I really do research on, and I'm very passionate about sort of stories about biodiversity and species extinction, endangered species, why we care about some species, not others, what stories get told about them. And by the way, the one book in the list, Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, is about monarch butterflies, among many other things. And that's not a sci-fi novel, it's very present day, but it's really, really beautifully written. So I like the scenes in the novel where they talk about wildlife and they reintroduce wildlife, and they sort of try to confront the people who don't want, like, wolves and mountain lions to be reintroduced. So I like those sort of passages where he goes into the wildlife transitions. But I have to say, I agree with Diana. I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson is always interested in the economics and economic mechanisms. And so I kind of love this idea of CQE, carbon quantitative easing, do for the climate crisis what you did for the stock market crash of 2008. I mean, these are just crazy ideas, but they're really great ideas, actually. So those are sort of some of the things that I really loved about the book.
Yeah, I likewise love the rewilding idea. I was in Glacier National Park for my honeymoon, and there were, you'd go to the bathroom and there would be a buffalo standing, right next to you. And I was just thinking, like, how awesome would it be in our everyday lives to be, to have like creatures around us and to be inspired by that. And
I think keeping Tom Buffalo.
Yeah. They weren't even afraid of humans. They were just, everywhere. But definitely agree. Great. Well, thank you so much for the great discussion. And really, this was the idea behind the book club, that we could really connect with one another about ideas and books. And like I said, so much of time now is spent scrolling on, social media. And I really think part of the solution is reading again and really going into depth on ideas with other people. So thank you, everyone. Let's see. Can we get to the slides again? Oh, there we go. Okay. So if you enjoyed this event and are interested in participating in the WCS Book Club, there are 3 ways you can do that. So you can join our WCS Book Club Slack group. Every time we do a book club event, we will have a Slack channel where people can share their ideas ahead of the event, as well as post related articles. Just a way to kind of get the conversation started before the event actually takes place. Also, there's a link to a survey. So if you're interested, you can help us to pick our next book. So fill that out. And then if you're interested in helping plan future WCS Book Club events, please email me at nzant@meterleader.com. And then I just want to say thank you to all the volunteers today. Without you, this event wouldn't be possible. So we really appreciate your help. Just want to make a few announcements. We have some upcoming WCS events. In particular, we have a great event on October 13th, investigating microfiber pollution in fashion, as well as a ESG reporting panel on October 28th. And then, like we mentioned earlier, Professor Ursula was kind enough to share this event that will be taking place at UCLA with Kim Stanley Robinson. So this will take place on November 30th. And it will be held in person as well as live streamed. So if you enjoyed reading, or if you enjoy this author, this might be an event that you might be interested in attending. And then if you haven't already done so, we have a community and membership survey. It only takes a few minutes to fill out, and all you have to do is place your phone on this nice QR code and go ahead and fill it out. And so with that, I just want to say again, thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you for the amazing discussion. I really feel like I got a lot out of this event, and I hope you did too. And please make sure if you have social media, follow Women in Clean Tech on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hope
Thank
you
you.
enjoyed.
Thank you,
Thank
Natalie.
you. Bye.
Thank you.